Hi there, and welcome to Ancient Rome Part 2. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the first segment. And so today we're going to get into the Roman emperors and all kinds of debauchery and interesting stories, all supported by lots of primary source data and views from historians. We'll mention Mary Beard and some other things again. So hang on to your seats. Here we go. All right, so historians divide Roman history into two broad periods. You have the Roman Republic, which began in 509 BC, and the period of empire began somewhere around 27 BC, and you'll see why as I go through this. So, the rule of Augustus Caesar, this may be a name you know if you've read the Bible or know much about it, you know that he was emperor at the time of Christ, and so there are going to be some biblical allusions in all of this, and I'll try to weave in a little bit of real history just to give you guys a little bit of that part of the narrative. So Augustus Caesar was technically the first Roman emperor. He remember that Rome was said to be in the quote Pax Romana, which is Roman peace under his leadership. So that's good, right? And Augustus laid a framework for Roman emperors that lasted for over 200 years. Every emperor after Augustus impersonated him in some way. Now, Augustus died in AD 14. He was just shy of his 70th birthday, and so the historian Suetonius recorded that he was playing a game with guests at one of his homes while he was on a holiday in the island of Capri. And when he returned to the mainland, he went to bed with severe stomach pain and later died. Now, the historian Suetonius, and I've got this picture of historiography here. This is where this information comes from. If you're interested in learning more about historiography, this book on the left is excellent resource. But basically, the historian Suetonius was a chief secretary to Emperor Hadrian, and so this gave him access to the imperial depositories. Now, he authored a book called The 12 Caesars, and Suetonius examined how the Greeks and Romans differed in their views of events and people. He also worked to explain each emperor's personal life and character while making connections between individual lives and collective destinies. So some of his critics have said his work was too dramatic and it's filled with too much scandal. Others have said it's kind of difficult to avoid scandal during this time period, so it's sort of to be expected. So, but that gives you an idea of who Suetonius was. Now, the death of Augustus caused lots of rumors to spread, of course, as you can imagine. His wife, Livia, was accused of poisoning him in order to bring Tiberius, their son, into power. And Mary Beard argues that this is possible, but it's more plausible that she simply worked to ensure a smooth transition of power. So, as soon as her husband's death looked imminent, she sent for Tiberius because he was very far away. It took about 5 days for him to get home, and he would need to be sworn in as this new emperor. Now, Tiberius reigned from AD 14 to 37, and he was referred to as Tiberius Caesar or sometimes simply Caesar. And Tiberius was skilled with foreign affairs. He was not so great with domestic policy. And so he wasn't exactly popular like his father was. You know, the Romans loved his father, but he was known for mishandling finances and other things, and he kind of gained a little bit of a reputation. Now, he was actually Augustus Caesar's stepson. His wife, Livia, Augustus Caesar's wife, Livia, divorced his father to marry Augustus. Now, note that her first marriage lasted only 2 years, and she and Augustus were married for 52 years. And so Augustus had been married 3 times. His only child is Julia. She was a product of his second marriage, which really was more of a political alliance. Now, Tiberius had a strained relationship with his stepfather for several reasons. When he was 14, he went with Augustus on a military expedition in Spain. along with Augustus's nephew, Marcellus. And at the time, Marcellus was betrothed to Augustus's daughter, Julia. And Julia and Marcellus married, but he died only a few years later. And so then she married Vipsania Agrippa, who was about twice her age, and he suddenly died from an illness. And Augustus was concerned for his daughter, who had five children at the time, and so he ordered Tiberius to divorce his current wife and marry Julia. Well, you can imagine how that went over. Tacitus recorded that there were what were known as the good years of Tiberius's reign. And so, according to historian Robin Seeger, Suetonius and Dio record that Tiberius consulted the Senate on nearly every issue, no matter how trivial or how vital it might seem. He made no complaint if his motions were defeated, and he found himself in the minority in the division. And so, as time went by, Tiberius became reclusive. He began spending a great deal of time at the island of Capri, where his stepfather passed. Though he repeatedly came close to Rome, even visiting the gardens on the banks of the Tiber, he couldn't bring himself to enter the city. Tiberius died in AD 37 at the age of 77, and he was succeeded by Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, who is better known as Caligula. And so this brings us to a very interesting little segment. Caligula is a colloquial name, sort of a pet name. It was thanks to his parents, Mary Beard says, that Gaius ended up with this embarrassing nickname. It actually means bootykins. And so kind of funny that this stuck, but they had taken him as a young child on military campaigns, dressed him up in a miniature soldier's uniform, including trademark miniature army boots, which, these things are very expensive, and at the time, children didn't typically have shoes. Like the idea that we have Nike shoes for kids and they're all over the place today, that wasn't really heard of back then. So for him to have these boots was a big deal, and it earned him this wonderful nickname, Bootykins. And so his real name is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, or Caligula. And so he was only on the throne for about 3 years before he was assassinated by three soldiers from the Praetorian Guard. And his death is one of the most well documented events from this time period because of the historian Josephus. Now, Josephus is really known for his account of the Jews. Outside of the Old Testament, Josephus really is the only account of Jewish history. And some of it is a little different. Most of it's pretty similar, corroborates the Old Testament, but he's got a few nuanced differences. But he does record this situation here. Now, Josephus notably was half Jew, half Roman. He was there at the siege of Masada and the Roman overtake of Jerusalem and things like that. So he provides us with a firsthand account of all of this, which is very significant. But Josephus saw Gaius' death as divine punishment for the mistreatment of the Jewish people. Now, Mary Beard, she says this: Josephus's account of the assassination is richly revealing about the new world of politics that followed the first Augustus. From the palace intrigues through the empty slogans of the old senatorial elite and the problems of succession to the perils of being an emperor on the throne. What is more, the various assessments, both ancient and modern, of Gaius's faults and failings, of what lay behind his murder, and of what followed it, to the point of two important questions. These are the questions. How was the reputation of Roman emperors created? In other words, how was their success or failure judged? And how do the character qualities of the emperors help researchers to understand the broader implications of Rome under imperial rule? And these are essential questions. When we think, like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, I'm going to talk about Roman emperors. You probably all thought about the word debauchery or something similar before I ever even said it. And so, how was this reputation created? Were there any successes? Were there good things about these emperors? And how should we judge them? And how does this impact the trajectory of Roman history? And so there's a turning point here. As both Caesar and Gaius found, anyone in power was most at risk from those who were allowed to come closest to them. However, the assassination of Gaius was a turning point in Roman history because prior to this, soldiers wielded power at the command of the emperor. However, the Praetorian Guard immediately installed Gaius's successor, Claudius, who was the uncle of Gaius. So all of a sudden, it's a power struggle, right? Which is why it's a turning point. And supposedly, Claudius was afraid that the Praetorian Guard was planning to assassinate him, so he's hiding in a dark alley, right? Doesn't know what's going on. He's shocked when the guards find him. They hail him as the new emperor. And in return, he gave the guards vast handouts, which made him the first emperor in history, in ancient Roman history, to use bribery to secure loyalty. Now, you can imagine this had notable effects. So, after this, the senators gave up any notion of Republican liberty. At first, they tried to persuade Claudius to accept the throne from them in order to maintain political order. And Claudius had some of the assassins executed because he believed that disloyalty had to be punished, so a show, so to speak. And this caused some of the senators to be afraid, so they retreated to their country estates. So you can kind of see the shift in power here. The Praetorian Guard picking up a lot of power and the senators becoming less essential. Now, the events are a vivid snapshot of the policies of the Roman autocracy. This is almost 30 years after the death of Augustus. And the Senate's ineffective posturing over the restoration of the Republic serves only to prove that the old system of government was gone for good. And that's according to Mary Beard, and many other historians will corroborate that view. So that brings us to Nero. And the way I used to teach my children, I used to homeschool my kids when they were young, and we would say, Nero, not a hero. And so it's kind of where we land on this one. Nero Claudius Divi Claudius Filius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. A beautiful name for someone with maybe not quite such a stellar character. Although he didn't exactly like start out that way, which is very interesting. He is the fifth emperor of Rome, infamous for debauchery. He showed genuine humility as a young leader, which might surprise you. Supposedly, he was once told that a silver statue would be made in his honor, and he shyly declined the offer. So, not really prideful when he was young. When it was requested that he sign his first death sentence, he's quoted saying, "Would that I had never learned to write." And so it pained him. It pained him to sentence someone to an execution. He didn't seem to want attention, but somehow all of that changed. And so Nero became an emperor at the age of 17, and he grew into a man who enjoyed indulgence. He is said to have slept most of the day away. He conducted business in the evening. He developed a strong sense of paranoia, which caused him to have many people murdered, including his own mother, his wife Octavia, and his half brother Seneca. Nero loved the arts and the theater, and he especially enjoyed chariot races. He loved the theater so much that he created a law against leaving the theater early. Imagine if it was illegal to leave a movie theater early in our society today. That's kind of what this was like. And so, although a little bit different, but he often spent more time in Greece than in Rome because he loved the arts so much. Now, Nero was unpopular with the Romans, obviously, and he often complained about the layout of the city. You know, he's comparing it to Greece. They have all this amazing architecture in Greece, but there's not really any room to build in Rome. So in AD 64, the city went up in flames, destroying about two-thirds of the acreage, making room for new construction. And some of the Romans lost their lives. Nero appeared guilty, and so he quickly built relief stations for those who had been displaced, and he had to find a scapegoat. You can imagine who that was. Now, because he was under public scrutiny, he wanted to blame like the drudges of society, which at the time was the Christians. The Christians were a major problem because a lot of people in Rome, they earned a living off of selling these little statues of gods, and religion was a major way of life. And so you have the Christians coming in talking about Jesus Christ, talking about monotheism. They're upsetting Roman society, right? And so they were were already an unpopular group because of the economic strain and the religious and cultural strain. And so it was pretty easy for Nero to say, oh, well, they did it. And so it was under Nero that a lot of important biblical figures were executed. And this is just true history. The biblical figures of Peter and Paul are believed to have died under the reign of Nero. Paul was beheaded. He was a Roman citizen, so he couldn't be crucified. And Peter was crucified upside down. They were going to crucify him right side up, but he said he couldn't die the same way that his Savior did, and he had to do it in the opposite way, not to impugn what Christ did. And so, but basically, the Christians, they took the fall for the fire and the rebuilding situation. And so, historians have divided Christian persecution under the Romans into segments. The first wave occurred under Nero. The second onslaught occurred under the reign of Domitian between AD 81 and 96. And the third was under Emperor Trajan, who made Christianity a capital offense. So Nero died in AD 68. By the time he was 30 years old, the Roman Senate had lost their patience with him. The soldiers tried to hunt him down, but he hid, and eventually he committed suicide with the help of his assistant. So this is a picture of his tomb. It's located on Pincian Hill in Rome. If you want to read more about Nero, you can read Rome is Burning, Nero and the Fire That Ended a Dynasty by Anthony Barrett. Great read. So, after Nero's death, a brief civil war took place in AD 68 and 69, which became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. After this, Vespasian, who was the only emperor in the first two dynasties to die without any suspicion of foul play, that ushered in what became known as the Flavian dynasty. Flavian, tomato, however you want to say that, but those before him were called Julio-Claudians. And so Vespasian was emperor from AD 69 to 79. He funded massive construction projects like the Flavian Amphitheater, which is known today as the Colosseum. And so one of his essential accomplishments was the final overthrow of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is a pretty big deal, especially if you are a Bible believer. This is a pivotal event. His son Titus had an arch constructed to memorialize the victory. And so the event is essential because it ultimately sent the Jews into nomadic exile. And so I have another video on Jewish history. I actually do a lot of research on Jewish history. If you're interested, you can go check that out as well. So, but this is a picture of the Arch of Titus that commemorates the sacking of Jerusalem in AD 70. And a better way to look at it is in color. They think that when it was actually created, it was probably painted and probably looked something like this. And so you can see the Romans just carrying out all of the spoils of war. You've got the menorah. You've got the golden lampstand and the trumpets and the table of showbread and all kinds of things from the Jewish temple, all of these very essential pieces that were taken back to Rome. Now, we're not really sure what happened to these. I'll fast forward ahead just for those who are interested. We think that when the Germanic tribes came in and overtook Rome, somewhere around the 400 ADs, they looted these items and took them, and they were lost in time. And so probably the Goths or the Visigoths, something like that, they took these items away. But there is a Roman coin. It's very essential. It's called the Judea Capta coin. The Carlos Museum actually has one, so you can see it in person if you're ever over there. But it has this, the Emperor Vespasian is here. And then you've got this weeping Jew under this palm tree and this sort of like gloating Roman soldier to show that the Jews had been taken captive, Judea Capta. And so that brings us to the siege of Masada. And so this happened between AD 66 and 73. Masada is a great fortress. It's an incredible tourist attraction if you're interested in going there. It's really quite something to see. But the Masada was built by Herod the Great. And like other Roman leaders, Herod was concerned that someone might try to assassinate him. And so he needed a place to flee. And so he took care of this by building a fortress on the side of a mountain. He added storehouses for grain and cisterns to collect water. And Masada, as you can see in the picture, it's very difficult to climb. The plateau is about 400 meters above the Dead Sea. And so it was just an incredible place if you wanted a stronghold. You can kind of see here what this looks like. You've got the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and Masada here. So the Jews who fled Jerusalem when Emperor Vespasian's army invaded became known as Zealots. They are named Sicarii for the method in which they fought with daggers. Now the Zealots found refuge in Masada under the leadership of Eleazar ben Yair, and they were able to overtake the few Roman soldiers who guarded it. Now, in time, the Roman Emperor Vespasian heard about the Jews hiding in Masada, and so he dispatched about 20,000 soldiers to eradicate them, and Josephus was there, right? Remember our historian, our resident historian, Josephus? And so he was one of the Jews hiding at Masada, and he lived to tell the tale. Most of them didn't, and you'll find out why in just a minute if you are unfamiliar with the story. But Josephus lived, and we get this firsthand account. And so the Romans had difficulty breaching Masada because it's such a steep climb, and the Jews threw rocks and weapons at them from above. They did everything they could to stop them. Josephus records that it took the Romans about 7 months to overtake the Jews, and they were only able to do this by constructing a wooden ramp. So you kind of see what this may have looked like in the picture here. And so the Romans brought up a battering ram, and there's a reason it's called a battering ram. You can see this is from the National Military Museum in Bucharest, Romania. They actually did put a ram's head on some of these. Some of them were not quite as elaborate and fancy as this, and they were just giant logs or whatever, but literally a battering ram. And so part of the ramp caught on fire while they were trying to work on this, and so the Romans had to retreat. And the next day, and the Jews at this point, they knew they had been beaten, and they didn't really know what to do, so they decided to commit suicide rather than face capture by the Romans, who would certainly kill them, probably through crucifixion anyway. And so Josephus tells us that 2 women and 5 children went into hiding and survived. Here's a picture. This is a very nice model of Masada. And here's some pictures. You can see the floor. It's all very elaborate. I mean, it was built by Herod the Great, so he spared no expense in putting all kinds of decorative styles into it and things like that. You can see some of this is reconstructed for tourism, but you can kind of see what the inside of the walls looked like. And here you can see the pigeon coop. So this is kind of fun. Herod was so hated that the only thing that's said about him in the Mishnah is that he introduced a new breed of pigeons. And so these were his infamous pigeon coops. And so that kind of brings us to the city of Pompeii. I'm going to change gears a little bit now. Let me just say this very quickly about Masada. So Josephus is captured. He's taken back to Rome. And that's where, while he's in prison, he writes these histories of the Jews. He writes an autobiography and all of these things. And he becomes really popular with the Roman people. And even though it's a history of the Jews, he kind of frames it in a way that it could be read based on either side of the story, almost like a Roman victory story, but also a woe is me tale of the Jews. And so it made him a very popular man in Rome, and his stories were published and widely read. So, moving on. The buried city of Pompeii. So, in AD 79, Pompeii was a bustling city that it was buried under ash from Mount Vesuvius. Now, you guys may have heard this story before. Mary Beard has an excellent documentary that really goes deeply into this. I encourage you guys to watch it if you're not familiar. She basically tours the town, shows you all the things, and it's very interesting. But the pressure under Mount Vesuvius was so great that its contents went nearly 12 miles high. It's kind of similar to Mount St. Helens in 1980, if you're familiar with that. So you can see here where Pompeii is. It's down kind of in the southern portion of Italy here. And so after about 11 hours, the pressure of the volcano weakened quickly, and this caused great columns of ash and rock to collapse. And at this point, some people had already died, but anyone left would have been killed instantly by the scorching heat and vapors. And so the town was buried under 12 feet of ash. And so you can imagine what that probably looked like if you're hanging out in one of the Roman baths or, in the green space or whatever. It might have looked something like this. But the people indoors probably thought it was an earthquake. It was undeniable if you were outside that this is a volcano. Now, some people fled by boat or foot, some on horseback. A lot of them were hit with rocks as they left. Hot lava was suspended in the air, so they couldn't jump over it as they fled. Ash fell at a rate of probably about 6 inches per hour. It's insane. And so what happened is these people are essentially frozen in time. The fate of Pompeii was very unique because of this. In the 1700s, locals discovered that the town it was almost completely undisturbed. So the beauty is, if you're a historian and you want to see what a Roman town looked like in its heyday, it was well preserved. And so, they even had elections going on, and you have these yard signs, sort of like what we have during our elections. Now, if you compare the Roman Republic to our republic, there are a lot of similarities. And in this particular sign, it says, "Please elect Helvius Sabinus Aedile, worthy of office and a good man." So, very similar to what you see today. Okay, so go watch Mary Beard if you're interested in that. I'm going to go back to the emperors now and just kind of keep the story going. So, Titus reigned after Vespasian from AD 79 to 81, and in many ways he carried on the work of Vespasian. After Titus died of a fever, his brother Domitian took the throne and he reigned from AD 81 to 96. Now, that brings us to Pliny the Younger. Pliny wrote 10 books of letters, 247 letters in the first 9 books, and more than 100 in the 10th. The other major letter writer of the ancient Roman world was Cicero. And Pliny regularly wrote home to consult the emperor or to make administrative queries. He worked on local finances and ambitious construction projects. So, according to Mary Beard, Pliny presents himself as the kind of cultured and conscientious public servant that Augustus must have dreamed of in a senator. He was an orator and an advocate, largely making his name in the court that specialized in disputed inheritances. His political career, which started under Domitian and continued until later emperors, included many major administrative responsibilities. And so you can kind of see, I hope you're picking up on this as you watch some of these videos, that whatever this historian's experience was, that would be how they would frame history. If you were a military person, you would probably focus on military aspects of history. If you're a political person, you would focus on the politics of the day. I mean, whatever it was, or maybe you just wanted to write history to entertain people. It's not so different from what we have going on today, actually. Human nature doesn't change a whole lot over time, but cultural nuances do. So, Mary Beard goes on to say that Pliny's letters are not free from complaints and annoyance, but overall the letters offer sunny and slightly self-congratulatory image of senatorial life. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all of these other emperors because we would be here for quite some time, but this is a basic list if you want to take a screenshot or just write these down. You got Trajan, Hadrian, and so on and so on. Hadrian is one that I did want to camp out on for just a minute because Hadrian's Wall is a place of significance in Britain. And so you can kind of see here, this was when they occupied Britain for a time and they built this boundary wall, and then they occupied more area, and there's another wall a little bit further north, and so that is relatively essential and notable. So you can kind of see here what Britain looked like under the Romans. This was from about 383 to 410. And so I'm going to skip forward to Diocletian. And so now we're in AD 284 to 305. Diocletian is an interesting emperor because he was born in poverty, but he had military capability. He was very intelligent. And so the army actually voted him in. Remember, the Senate at this point is sort of a figurehead, if they even really existed at all. And the army voted him in as an emperor in AD 284. Now, he felt like Rome was too large for one man to rule alone, and so he divided it into east and west. Now, here's a map of these subdivisions. He created prefectures ruled by prefects, dioceses ruled by vicars, and provinces ruled by governors. And so the word prefectus means the one who stands in front. And there were various offices of the Senate that had a prefectorial rank. And so overall, during this time, Rome was divided into 120 provinces. And so you can see here, if you paid attention to the timeline at 305, we're getting down to the last like 170-ish years of Rome's history. And so, to boost the economy, Diocletian placed more silver coins in circulation, and that caused inflation. He also tried to place limits on the amount of money that a person could earn, and this led to an economic recession. So, food became scarce, rioting broke out, and the population declined, and taxes surged. So, great with military adventures, maybe not so great with domestic policy. So Diocletian named himself Dominus Noster, which is Latin for our Lord. He also demanded to be worshipped as the god Jupiter, and that caused problems with the Christians. Remember, at this time, Rome has been Christianized, and so this problem worsened when he forbade them to assemble, and he destroyed as many copies of the Bible as he could find. So, just a little bit of a backstory, a little bit of a front story, I should say. Constantine the First is known for the Edict of Milan. And so at this point, okay, Christianity has blossomed in Rome. The persecution of the Christians officially came to a halt in 313 under Emperor Constantine. And that's significant. So you've kind of got this list of Roman emperors here. And I think that is where I'm going to close it out for today. That's a lot of information that we've covered so far. I will do one more segment, Rome Part 3. We'll talk about the fall of Rome. We'll actually talk about the Christianization. How did Rome adopt Christianity as their religion? What did that look like? When did Rome fall? And then what about the Byzantine Empire and this revived Rome? What did that look like? So that'll be on part 3. I appreciate you guys watching today, and I will see you next time.